The bridge is community property, Mr. Henderson. We will require a key to the gate and unrestricted 24-hour access, effective immediately. That was the line that started it all. It wasn't delivered with a smile or a hint of negotiation. It was a declaration, cold and hard as the cheap concrete in a city sidewalk, delivered by a woman who looked like she gargled with vinegar every morning just for the sheer joy of it. If you're tuning in for another tale of HOA insanity, you've come to the right place. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because you're not going to believe where this one goes. What would you do if someone tried to steal the literal ground from under your feet, or in my case, the bridge over your ravine? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. This whole mess started because I bought a piece of heaven and found out it was managed by a woman who ran her little corner of hell with an iron fist and a 3-ring binder full of violations. I'm a structural engineer, recently widowed, and all I wanted was to live out my days in the quiet house my late wife, Clara, and I had designed together. The centerpiece of our dream was a beautiful, private bridge I engineered and built myself, spanning the 100-foot ravine that cut my property off from the rest of the world. It was my way in and my way out. It was mine. Or so I thought. Brenda, the HOA president, had other plans. She didn't just want access, she wanted control, and she was about to find out that while I don't start fights, I am meticulous, patient, and very, very good at finishing them. My name is Frank Henderson. For 40 years, I designed and oversaw the construction of bridges. Big ones. The kind of massive steel and concrete behemoths that carry thousands of cars a day over sprawling rivers. I loved my job. It was a profession of logic, physics, and immutable laws. Stress, strain, load capacity, these were my languages. Concrete doesn't have feelings. Steel doesn't lie. You do the math right, and the structure stands. You get it wrong, and it collapses. Simple. When Clara passed, the world of logic and order I had built for myself crumbled like poorly mixed aggregate. The big city house felt hollow, a concrete shell echoing with memories. We had always planned to retire out here, in Creekwood Estates, on a secluded plot of land we'd bought a decade earlier. It was our someday project. After she was gone, someday was all I had left. So I sold everything and built our dream house myself, right on the edge of that ravine. The final, most important piece was the bridge. It wasn't just a path, it was a monument to my career, to my love for Clara. I designed it to be elegant but brutally strong, a single-span steel girder bridge with a reinforced concrete deck, capable of holding a main battle tank, though the heaviest thing it ever saw was my pickup truck. It was my masterpiece, my private connection to the world, secured by a heavy steel gate at the far end where it met the neighborhood's main road. My deed was crystal clear, my property line extended to the edge of that road. The bridge was entirely on my land. Creekwood Estates was, on the surface, idyllic. Winding roads, mature oak trees, and a handful of custom homes spaced far apart. The HOA, when I'd first looked into it, seemed like a formality. The covenants were standard stuff, no junk cars in the yard, keep your lawn mowed. Reasonable. For the first year, it was peaceful. I grieved, I worked on the house, and I found a quiet rhythm. I rarely saw my neighbors and had no contact with the HOA. Bliss. Then Brenda happened. She introduced herself at my mailbox one afternoon, her smile as thin and tight as a banjo string. Her name was Brenda McMillan, and she was the president, founder, and apparently supreme commander of the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association. She had a clipboard in one hand and a look in her eyes that sized up my property not for its beauty, but for its potential violations. Just making my rounds, she'd said, her gaze lingering on my workshop. We like to keep a tidy community here, Mr. Henderson. I just nodded and retreated into my house. I was a tidy man by nature. I wasn't worried. That was my first mistake. The letter arrived a week later. It was printed on cheap paper but filled with expensive-sounding legal jargon. It talked about community assets, emergency vehicle access, and shared responsibilities. It was a masterpiece of corporate nonsense, but the core demand was simple and insane. It claimed that because my bridge could be used by emergency services, it was therefore a de facto community asset. As such, the letter concluded, the board has voted to formalize this access. Please provide one copy of the gate key to the HOA office, which I knew was just her spare bedroom, within 7 business days. I read it twice, then a third time, a slow burn starting in my chest. It wasn't a request. It was an order. She was trying to commandeer my private property. My bridge. The last thing I had built with Clara in mind. I'm not a confrontational man. My first instinct is always to de-escalate, to apply logic. I wrote a polite, carefully worded letter back to her. I included a copy of my property survey, the relevant section of my deed highlighted in yellow, and a brief, friendly explanation of liability. I pointed out that if someone were to get hurt on my bridge, I would be legally responsible, and therefore I could not grant unrestricted access. I thought that would be the end of it. Logic, after all, was an immutable law. I was wrong. Brenda didn't operate on logic. She operated on power. Her response was not a letter. It was a notice, taped to my new gate. A bright orange sticker declaring a violation in big, angry letters. The supposed violation. Failure to comply with an official HOA directive. Below it, in marker, she had scrawled, fine, $100 per day, retroactive to the deadline. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. It was like a fly trying to find a battleship. I peeled the sticker off, folded it neatly, and placed it in a file I had just labeled Brenda. I had a feeling the file was going to get thick. The escalation was swift and petty. A week later, another violation notice appeared, this time for my grass being 3 inches high in one spot near the road. The rulebook, she helpfully cited, stipulated a maximum of 2.5 inches. The fine was another $50. Then came a notice about my garbage cans being visible from the street for 3 hours after the trash had been collected. Another $50. It was clear what she was doing. She was trying to bleed me with 1,000 paper cuts, to make my life so miserable that I would give in just to make it stop. The fines were a joke, legally unenforceable without a court judgment, but the harassment was real. I saw her car driving past my house, slowly, several times a day. Her beady eyes were always fixed on my bridge. I tried talking to a few of my neighbors. Most of them just shrugged, a haunted, defeated look in their eyes. That's just Brenda, one of them, a guy named Tom, told me over the fence. It's easier to just do what she says. She tried to fine me once because my garden hose wasn't coiled in a perfect circle. They were scared of her. She had built a tiny kingdom, and she ruled it through fear and intimidation. But I wasn't scared. I was an engineer. I dealt with immense pressures and forces every day. Brenda was just a nuisance, a poorly calculated variable I needed to solve for. The conflict needed a new variable. I ignored the fines and sent her a certified letter from my lawyer, a friend from my old life who owed me a favor. It was simple. It stated that my property was private, her claims were baseless, and any further harassment would be met with legal action. It also formally put her on notice: if she or anyone from the HOA set foot on my property, including the bridge, they would be charged with trespassing. This, I thought, would be the checkmate. You can't argue with a formal legal notice. Brenda, however, saw my lawyer's letter not as a checkmate, but as an opening gambit. She doubled down. Her next move was to send out a neighborhood-wide email. The subject line was, Community Safety Alert. The email was a work of fiction. In it, she painted me as a selfish, uncooperative recluse who was putting the entire community at risk. She fabricated a story about a recent storm where a fallen tree had supposedly blocked the main road, and if a fire had broken out, my hoarded bridge was the only other way out. Mr. Henderson's refusal to grant access to this vital emergency route, she wrote, is a danger to us all. He is prioritizing his privacy over the lives of your children. It was disgusting. It was a lie. The storm she mentioned had dropped a few branches, nothing more. But it was effective. The next time I saw Tom, he wouldn't meet my eye. The fear she peddled was working. She was turning the community against me. But the real turning point, the moment this went from a petty squabble to a Cold War, came about a month later. It was the incident that pushed me past the point of passive defense and into the realm of strategic retaliation. There's only one road into and out of Creekwood Estates. It's a long, winding 2-lane road that eventually leads to the main highway. My bridge offered a shortcut, but it was my shortcut. Brenda's grand lie was that this main road was somehow unreliable. To make her lie a reality, she decided to create her own emergency. One Saturday morning, I heard the rumble of a heavy truck. I looked out my window and saw a dump truck and a small backhoe at the entrance to our neighborhood, right where the long road began. Brenda was there, clipboard in hand, directing them. They were dumping massive boulders and piles of dirt, effectively blocking one of the lanes. They were planting mature trees and shrubs right on the shoulder, creating a chicane so narrow that a fire truck or an ambulance would have to slow to a crawl to get through. She was manufacturing the very crisis she'd warned everyone about. She was constricting the neighborhood's main artery to make my bridge seem more essential. It was diabolical and, I suspected, wildly illegal. The real cost of her scheme became apparent 3 days later. I was in my workshop when I heard the distant wail of a siren. It grew closer, then seemed to stop abruptly near the entrance of the neighborhood. I walked outside and saw it, an ambulance, its lights flashing, struggling to navigate the ridiculous obstacle course Brenda had created. It was trying to get to the house of the Cunninghams, an elderly couple who lived at the far end of the development. Mr. Cunningham had a heart condition. The ambulance lost at least 2, maybe 3, precious minutes getting through. I felt a cold knot of fury tighten in my stomach. This wasn't about fines or grass height anymore. This was dangerous. This was a woman so consumed by her desire for control that she would risk someone's life to get her way. Mr. Cunningham survived, thank God. But that was it. The line had been crossed. The engineer in me who sought balance and order was shoved aside by something colder, more calculating. Brenda had declared war. She just didn't realize her opponent designed things to withstand forces 1,000 times stronger than she could ever generate. My peace-seeking phase was over. It was time to become a proactive strategist. It was time to dig. My first step was to treat this not as a personal dispute, but as an engineering problem. The problem was Brenda. The solution was to find her structural weaknesses and apply overwhelming, targeted pressure until she failed. Every structure has a breaking point. I just needed to find hers. I started with the basics, public records. I spent 2 days at the county records office, pulling every document related to Creekwood Estates. The original subdivision plats, the articles of incorporation for the HOA, the bylaws, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS. I read every single line. The first interesting discovery was that the HOA was barely legitimate. It had been formed by the original developer, as is standard, but after he sold the last lot, control was supposed to be transferred to the homeowners. The records showed that never officially happened. Brenda had simply declared herself president at a sparsely attended meeting 5 years ago and had been running it as her personal fiefdom ever since. There were no records of official elections, no filed minutes, no transparency. Next, I looked at the property plats. They were exactly as I remembered. The road the bridge connected to was clearly marked as a public right-of-way. My property was clearly marked as private. The ravine was a natural boundary. There was no mention anywhere of a community asset or an emergency access easement across my land. Her entire claim was built on thin air. This was all good ammunition, but it was defensive. I needed something offensive. I needed to know why. Why was this bridge so important to her? It couldn't just be about power. A lust for control didn't explain the sheer obsession, the willingness to risk lives. There had to be something else. There had to be money involved. So I started investigating her. I was methodical. I set up a new project file on my computer, this one labeled Project Takedown. I created subfolders for surveillance, public records, and financial analysis. The surveillance came first. I was an engineer, not a spy, but the principles are similar: gather accurate data from reliable sources. I ordered 4 state-of-the-art, motion-activated, night vision trail cameras. They were small, camouflaged, and had incredible battery life. I mounted them discreetly on trees overlooking my property line, the gate, and the bridge itself. Any movement would trigger a high-definition video recording, sent directly to my phone. Then I started looking into Brenda McMillan herself. A little creative searching online revealed she was a failed real estate agent who had lost her license a decade ago for unethical practices. Interesting. Her husband, a quiet, perpetually miserable-looking man named Gary, ran a struggling landscaping business. Even more interesting, given the recent beautification project at the neighborhood entrance. I pulled the HOA's financial statements, which she was legally required to make available to homeowners upon request. The documents she sent me were a mess, vague, amateurish, and full of suspicious entries. There were huge, recurring payments for legal consultation, land surveying, and community development planning. The recipient for most of these payments was a company I'd never heard of, Pinnacle Development Group LLC. A quick search of the state's business registry showed Pinnacle Development Group was a shell corporation, registered just 6 months prior. The registered agent was a lawyer known for handling shady land deals. There was no office, no website, just a post office box. The pieces were starting to click into place, forming a picture that was uglier than I could have imagined. I pulled up the county's GIS mapping system, a tool I used often in my work. I looked at the land surrounding Creekwood Estates. On the other side of the ravine, directly opposite my property, was a large, undeveloped tract of land. It was zoned for agriculture, but it was a prime piece of real estate. And that's when I found it. The critical weakness. The load-bearing point that, if compromised, would bring her whole corrupt structure down. There was a pending application with the County Planning Commission to rezone that tract of land for high-density residential development. The applicant: Pinnacle Development Group LLC. The plan was to build over 200 townhouses. But there was a problem. The land was essentially landlocked. The only way to access it was through a long, circuitous route that would require building a new, multi-million-dollar public road. Unless they could get access from Creekwood Estates. Unless they could use a pre-existing bridge to cross the ravine. My bridge. My heart hammered in my chest. It all made sense. Brenda wasn't just a power-hungry tyrant. She was a crook. She was using her position as HOA president to try and seize my private property to facilitate a lucrative development deal. The legal fees and surveying costs from the HOA budget weren't for the community. She was using our money to pay the developer's startup costs. She was embezzling funds to lay the groundwork for a deal that would make her and her developer cronies rich, while destroying the quiet character of our neighborhood. The emergency access claim was a lie. The harassment, the fines, the smear campaign, it was all a coordinated effort to force me to give up my bridge so she could cash in. Her blocking the main road wasn't just spite, it was a calculated move to create a paper trail of necessity that her crooked lawyers could use to try and force an easement through the courts. This was her weakness. This was the fraud. This was her breaking point. I had the theory. Now I needed the proof. I needed to catch her in the act. I needed to stress test her greed. My plan, which I now thought of as a controlled demolition, had 3 phases. Phase 1 was baiting the trap. Phase 2 was springing it. Phase 3 was watching the whole rotten structure collapse into a pile of dust. Phase 1 began with a bit of theater. I drove my truck into town and came back with a load of what looked like expensive survey equipment. A high-end theodolite, GPS marking poles, laser measures. In reality, it was all old, non-functional gear I bought for $100 from a retiring surveyor. I made a show of unloading it near the entrance to my bridge, in clear view of the road where I knew Brenda did her daily drive-by patrols. Then, I sent her a certified letter. It was different from the last one. It was conciliatory. I wrote that, after careful consideration of the community's safety concerns, I was willing to discuss a limited, emergency-only access agreement. I proposed a meeting to review the bridge's structural capacity and liability insurance requirements. It was a complete bluff, of course. But it was designed to do 2 things. First, to make her believe her pressure campaign was working and that I was about to fold. Second, to get her onto my property, near the bridge, where my cameras were waiting. An overconfident opponent is a careless opponent. I didn't have to wait long. 2 nights later, just after 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a notification from one of the trail cams. I opened the video feed, my heart pounding with a cold, thrilling anticipation. The infrared video was perfectly clear. 2 figures were creeping out of the darkness near my gate. One was Brenda. The other was a man in a cheap suit who looked like he sold used cars for a living. He was carrying a briefcase. They picked the lock on my gate, a simple chain lock I had put there as a decoy, and stepped onto my property. They walked onto the bridge, The man in the suit pulled out a tape measure and a notepad. Brenda was pointing, talking animatedly, her voice too low for the camera's microphone to pick up, but her gestures were clear. She was showing him the bridge, her bridge. They were discussing its dimensions, its construction. The man took some pictures with his phone. Then came the moment that sealed her fate. The man opened his briefcase and handed Brenda a thick manila envelope. She opened it, and even in the grainy black and white of the night vision, I could see the smile spread across her face as she looked inside. It was cash. A payoff. They spent 20 minutes on my property, trespassing, plotting, and conducting their dirty business. They were so arrogant, so sure of themselves, that they never once looked around for cameras. When they were done, they slipped back through the gate and disappeared into the night. I saved the video file to 3 separate hard drives and a cloud server. This was it. This was the irrefutable proof. Trespassing, conspiracy, and the visual evidence of a bribe. This was the beginning of her end. Phase 2 was springing the trap, but not in the way she would expect. I wasn't going to the police yet. That would be too quick, too merciful. Brenda had tried to humiliate me and turn my neighbors against me. Her downfall needed to be public. It needed to be administered in the very arena she had used as her weapon, the HOA meeting. I emailed the HOA board, which consisted of Brenda and 2 of her spineless cronies, and formally accepted their invitation to discuss the bridge. I requested that it be an open meeting for all homeowners, in the interest of full transparency. Brenda, smelling victory, agreed immediately. She probably imagined a public spectacle where I would be forced to capitulate and hand over the key. She sent out an email blast, announcing a special community meeting on the Creekwood Bridge resolution. The tone was triumphant. The meeting was held a week later in the small community clubhouse. The room was packed. Nearly every homeowner was there, drawn by the drama. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and resentment as I walked in. I was the villain of Brenda's story, the selfish neighbor endangering them all. I sat in the front row, a slim laptop bag at my feet. I remained silent, my face a mask of calm neutrality. Brenda stood at a podium at the front of the room, radiating smug satisfaction. She opened the meeting with a long, self-congratulatory speech about community spirit and civic duty. She rehashed her lies about the blocked road and the danger I was putting them in. But I am pleased to announce, she said, beaming at the crowd, that Mr. Henderson has finally seen reason. He has agreed to discuss granting the community the access it so desperately needs and deserves. She turned to me, a condescending smile on her face. Mr. Henderson, would you like to come forward and publicly affirm your commitment to the safety of your neighbors? This was her moment of triumph. The public shaming she had engineered. I stood up slowly and walked to the front of the room. The air was thick with tension. Thank you, Brenda, I said, my voice calm and even. I do have a few things I'd like to present. But first, I have a simple question for you. You have repeatedly claimed that my bridge is a community asset. Could you please show us, in the HOA's official documents or the county property records, where it says that? A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. This wasn't part of her script. That's a legal technicality, she snapped. The spirit of the community dictates. I'm not asking about spirits, Brenda, I interrupted, my voice still level. I'm an engineer. I deal in facts and documents. Do you have a document? A deed? An easement? Yes or no? She sputtered, well, no, not a specific document, but... Thank you, I turned to the audience. So, to be clear, the entire basis for this demand is not a legal right, but Brenda's opinion. I opened my laptop and connected it to the projector that was set up in the room. The first image that flashed on the screen was a high-resolution scan of my property survey, the boundaries clearly marked. This is my deed, I said, clicking to the next slide. As you can see, my property extends to the road. The bridge is 100% on my land. A murmur went through the crowd. This was the first time they had seen actual evidence, not just Brenda's hysterical emails. Brenda's face was turning a blotchy red. This is irrelevant, she shrieked. We are talking about saving lives. Are we? I said coolly. Or are we talking about a proposed 200-unit townhouse development on the other side of that ravine? The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. I clicked to the next slide. It was the county zoning application from Pinnacle Development Group. This application was filed 3 months ago, I explained. The developer needs a way to get construction equipment across that ravine. Building a new road would cost them millions. But access across a pre-existing bridge? Well, that would be practically free. I let that hang in the air for a moment. People were starting to look at each other, then at Brenda, their expressions shifting from suspicion of me to suspicion of her. Brenda was losing it. This is a conspiracy theory. He's making this up to distract from the real issue. Am I? I said. Brenda, who is Pinnacle Development Group? I have no idea what you're talking about, she stammered. Really? I gave her a thin, cold smile. That's funny. Because I have a video of you meeting with one of their representatives. On my bridge. In the middle of the night. 2 days ago. I hit the play button. The grainy, black and white infrared video filled the screen. The room gasped as they saw Brenda and the men in the cheap suit trespassing on my property. They watched in stunned silence as the men handed her the envelope. They saw her greedy smile as she looked at the cash. Brenda stood frozen, her face a mask of pure horror. The color drained from it, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She had walked right into the kill zone, and the trap had snapped shut with the force of 1,000 tons of steel. The crowd erupted. People were yelling, shouting questions at her. Is that true, Brenda? Did you take money? What have you been doing with our dues? She just stood there, speechless, exposed under the harsh glare of the projector. Her power, her credibility, her entire manufactured reality, it all evaporated in an instant. She was no longer the feared president of the HOA. She was just a common thief, caught on camera. But I wasn't done. This was just the first detonation. Her reaction was exactly what I had predicted. A cornered animal doesn't reason, it lashes out. The public humiliation broke something inside her. The smug, controlling tyrant was replaced by a rabid creature of pure rage and panic. The days following the meeting were a blur of escalating insanity. She didn't resign. She didn't retreat. She declared all-out war. She was digging her own grave, and my job was simply to hand her a bigger shovel. First came the official-looking letters from a law firm I'd never heard of, threatening a multi-million-dollar slap suit for defamation and libel. They were transparently bogus, designed to intimidate, but I forwarded them to my lawyer friend anyway. He laughed and told me they were worth less than the paper they were printed on. Then she weaponized the HOA again. An emergency board meeting was called, just her and her 2 pet board members, and they voted to place a lien on my property for the thousands of dollars in fake fines she had levied against me. It was a legally meaningless gesture without a court order, but the paperwork was filed with the county, creating a cloud on my title that would be a nuisance to clear up. But then she crossed a line that even I hadn't anticipated. She went personal. Deeply, viciously personal. She started a whisper campaign among the neighbors, full of vile, baseless accusations. She told people I was a drunk. She hinted that my engineering career had ended in disgrace. But her masterpiece of malice was a call to Child Protective Services. My son, his wife, and my 2 young grandchildren had come to visit for the weekend. They were the light of my life, the only thing that had kept me going after Clara died. My 5-year-old granddaughter, Lily, loved the bridge. She called it Grandpa's Giant Sidewalk. We were out on the deck, grilling burgers, when a car from the county pulled into my driveway. A grim-faced social worker informed me they had received an anonymous tip. The caller claimed I was an unstable, aggressive alcoholic who was endangering my grandchildren by allowing them to play on an unsafe, condemned structure. The rage that filled me was a white-hot, silent inferno. To bring my family into this, to use my grandchildren as pawns in her sick game, it was unforgivable. The social worker was professional but firm. She had to inspect the property and interview me and my son. I calmly complied, showing her my engineering plans for the bridge, the county permits, the final inspection certificate that declared it over-engineered and perfectly safe. She could see with her own eyes that the bridge was built like a fortress and that my grandchildren were happy and well cared for. She apologized for the intrusion, the anonymous complaint was deemed unfounded, and she left. But the damage was done. My son was furious. My daughter-in-law looked at me with worried eyes. The poison Brenda had injected had seeped into my sanctuary. That was her fatal mistake. Harassing me was one thing. Threatening my property, another. But using my family, my dead wife's legacy, and my love for my grandchildren as a weapon. That was an act of desecration. My plan for a controlled, public demolition was no longer sufficient. This required something more. This required annihilation. That night, after my family had gone to bed, I sat in my office and opened the Project Takedown file. It was time for the final phase. I had been holding back my most powerful weapon, waiting for the right moment. She had just given it to me. The whistleblower had contacted me a week before the HOA meeting. It was Gary, Brenda's husband. He called me from a burner phone, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and resolve. "She's out of control," he'd whispered. "She's going to ruin us all." He told me he was tired of the lies, tired of being complicit. He had been keeping his own set of records, copies of the real bank statements, the secret agreements with Pinnacle Development, the emails where Brenda explicitly detailed the plan to seize my bridge and embezzle the HOA funds to do it. He had a treasure trove of evidence. He had been too scared to come forward before. But Brenda's increasingly erratic behavior had pushed him over the edge. We had arranged a dead drop. He left a USB drive taped under a bench at a park miles away. I had reviewed the contents. It was everything I suspected and more. Forgery, wire fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement on a scale that was staggering for a small HOA. She hadn't just been paying for surveys, she had been funneling tens of thousands of dollars of the community's money into the developers' pockets and her own, disguised as legitimate expenses. She had been using Gary's landscaping company to fake invoices, laundering the money right under everyone's noses. I had been planning to reveal this at the meeting, but the video had been so effective, I decided to hold it in reserve. It was my ace in the hole. Now, after the call to CPS, I knew it was time to play it. The next morning, I didn't call the local police. This was bigger than a simple trespassing complaint. This was felony-level white-collar crime. I put on my only suit, gathered my evidence, the videos, the property records, and the entire contents of Gary's USB drive, printed and organized in a thick binder, and I drove to the county seat. I walked into the district attorney's office and asked to speak with someone in the economic crimes unit. I spent 3 hours with a lead investigator, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Detective Miller. I laid out the entire story, from the first letter to the CPS call. I presented the evidence methodically, like I was explaining a structural analysis. I gave her timelines, bank statements, video files, and a clear, concise narrative of a multi-year fraud and harassment campaign. She listened intently, her expression growing more grim with each piece of evidence I presented. When I played the night vision video of the cash payoff on the bridge, she just shook her head slowly. When I showed her the bank records from the USB drive, proving the embezzlement, she picked up her phone. "Get me a judge," she said to the person on the other end. "I need warrants. Multiple." The final showdown was almost poetic. It was staged at the place where it all began, the entrance to my bridge. Brenda, emboldened by my silence since the CPS call, had decided to force the issue. She had scheduled a community work day to remove my gate. She sent out another one of her inflammatory emails, claiming the gate was an illegal obstruction on a community right-of-way, and calling for volunteers to come with bolt cutters and crowbars. It was her last, desperate move to assert a dominance she no longer had. She was hoping for a confrontation she could twist to her advantage. What she got was a reckoning. On the morning of the work day, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching. A small crowd of about 10 people had gathered by my gate. Brenda was there, of course, dressed in a ridiculous-looking safari vest, holding a bullhorn. Her 2 cronies from the board were with her, looking nervous. A couple of other residents, the ones most thoroughly brainwashed by her propaganda, milled about uncertainly. Brenda raised the bullhorn. "All right, everyone. Today we take back what is ours. This selfish man has endangered our community for the last time. On the count of 3, we remove this illegal gate." She was practically foaming at the mouth, a petty dictator on the verge of a glorious revolution that existed only in her mind. Just as one of the men stepped forward with a pair of bolt cutters, two unmarked cars came speeding down the road and screeched to a halt behind the small crowd. Detective Miller stepped out of the first car, followed by two uniformed officers. Two more plainclothes detectives got out of the second. They moved with a calm, deliberate authority that made Brenda's blustering seem pathetic. "Brenda McMillan." Detective Miller's voice cut through the air like a diamond blade through soft brick. Brenda spun around, her face a comical mask of surprise and confusion. "Yes. Who are you?" "This is a private community event." "I'm Detective Miller with the county DA's office," she said, flashing her badge. "And you are under arrest." The silence was absolute. The men with the bolt cutters let them fall to the pavement with a loud clang. Brenda's brain seemed to short-circuit. She just stared, her mouth hanging open. "Under arrest? For what? This is ridiculous. I am the president of the Homeowners Association." "You're under arrest for felony embezzlement, wire fraud, conspiracy, and filing a false report with a government agency," Miller recited, her tone flat and unimpressed. She nodded to one of the officers, who stepped forward with a pair of handcuffs. That's when the meltdown began. It was spectacular. All the rage, the narcissism, and the desperation that had been simmering beneath her controlled facade erupted in a volcanic explosion of shrieking and denial. "You can't do this to me," she screamed, trying to back away. "This is his fault." She pointed a trembling finger at me, where I sat calmly on my porch. "He's the criminal. He forged those documents. He's trying to ruin me." The officer took her arm. She tried to rip it away, her face contorted in a grotesque snarl. "Get your hands off me. I know the mayor. I'll have your job." As they cuffed her, her tirade became a word salad of accusations and self-pity. She implicated her developer partner, her cronies on the board, even her own husband. In her panic, she was confessing to everything, trying to spread the blame like a cornered squid squirting ink. The other detectives were quietly taking her two board members aside, informing them they were also being detained for questioning. They folded like cheap lawn chairs, practically crying with fear. As the officer led the handcuffed, still screaming Brenda toward the car, she locked eyes with me. The look she gave me was one of pure, undiluted hatred. "You'll regret this, Henderson," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "I'll own you. I'll own this whole damn neighborhood. This isn't over." It was the last, hollow threat of a queen whose castle had just been reduced to rubble. It was pathetic. I just took a slow sip of my coffee and watched as they put her in the back of the car. I didn't smile. I didn't feel joy. I just felt quiet. The storm had passed. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The community, liberated from its tyrant, began to heal almost immediately. The story of Brenda's arrest and the full extent of her crimes spread like wildfire. The initial shock gave way to a collective sense of relief and no small amount of embarrassment for having let it go on for so long. The two crony board members, facing charges of their own, cooperated fully with the investigation, detailing years of Brenda's bullying and financial manipulation. The developer from Pinnacle Group was arrested a day later, and his whole townhouse project collapsed into a pile of lawsuits and bankruptcy filings. Brenda's case never made it to a full trial. Faced with the mountain of evidence, the videos, the bank records, the testimony of her husband and former allies, she took a plea deal. She was convicted on multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. The judge, citing the callousness of her actions and particularly the false CPS report, was not lenient. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. The financial ruin was total. She and Gary lost their house to pay back the nearly $100,000 she had stolen from the HOA's coffers. The lawsuits from the developer she had double-crossed took care of the rest. The last I heard, Gary had divorced her, moved out of state, and was trying to start over. Brenda McMillan, the supreme commander of Creekwood Estates, was left with nothing but a prison uniform and the bitter taste of her own spectacular failure. Poetic justice, I suppose. With Brenda gone, the neighborhood transformed. An emergency meeting was called, and this time it was different. People were talking to each other, apologizing for their silence, and working together. They formally dissolved the old, illegitimate HOA and formed a new one, with simple, common-sense rules and an elected board of actual neighbors. Tom, the guy who had been afraid of coiling his garden hose wrong, was elected the new president. His first official act was to pass a motion to use reserve funds to hire a crew to remove the ridiculous, hazardous landscaping Brenda had installed at the neighborhood entrance. The community treated me not just with respect, but with a quiet gratitude. People would wave as they drove by. A few even stopped by with a pie or a bottle of wine, awkwardly apologizing for having doubted me. I appreciated the gesture, but I didn't need their praise. I just needed my peace. I sat on my porch a lot in the months that followed, looking out at my bridge. It stood there, silent and strong, a testament to good design and solid construction. It had been the object of so much greed and conflict, the focal point of a war I never wanted to fight. But now, it was just a bridge again. My bridge. A pathway to the quiet life Clara and I had dreamed of. I often reflected on the whole ugly affair. I'm an engineer. I build things. My entire life has been about creating structures that are stable, durable, and useful. I never imagined that the same skills, meticulous research, careful planning, and the strategic application of pressure to exploit a structural weakness could be used not to build, but to dismantle. I had to design a controlled demolition of a person's life, all to protect my own. There's a part of me that regrets the necessity of it all. I came here seeking sanctuary, not a battlefield. But I also learned something important. Sometimes, standing up to a bully isn't about being confrontational or aggressive. Sometimes, it's about being patient, methodical, and smarter. It's about gathering your facts, building your case, and waiting for the perfect moment to present the undeniable, immutable truth. Because just like in engineering, some forces are absolute. Gravity always wins. And karma, I've found, has a pull that is just as strong. The peace I have now is deeper and more profound than the peace I had before. It's a peace I fought for, a foundation I secured against the storm. My home is no longer just a house, it's a fortress of tranquility I defended and won. My grandchildren visit often. Lily still loves to run across Grandpa's giant sidewalk, her laughter echoing in the quiet air. Every time I watch her, I'm reminded of what was at stake. It was never just about a bridge. It was about legacy. It was about protecting the small patch of the world where the memory of my wife lived on, a place where our dreams could finally rest, undisturbed. And now, they can. The bridge is secure. The house is quiet. And I am, at long last, at peace.